If you're new and visiting with us tonight, I just want to welcome you to One Church. We are a unique ragtag bunch of individuals. And I love these people so much, and we're happy to have you here. We want to welcome you here to join with us tonight as we celebrate together. My name is Angie Von Slaughter. I'm the lead pastor, but in all honesty, I'm just honored to be working alongside these people. We try to be safe. Here's something I've learned is that safety is never 100% guaranteed, but we certainly try to make that the pinnacle of who we are, to be safe and inclusive and reflecting that inclusive love of God. And that means for all people. It doesn't matter who you are. We really try to be embracing of all people. So before we go further, we're going to do something a little bit different tonight with our service. We have a short message and then a candle lighting time. But I hope to give you maybe a different perspective, not even give you something to think about tonight as we talk about Christmas. But before we go into that, I want to show you a video because I just thought it was adorable, and it kind of sets the tone for part of the message. So we can go ahead and play that video at the time.
An angel came to see Mary. She was doing laundry, and then the angel just appeared and she was really scared. So Gabriel was like, Mary, you're gonna have, I can't say it good. Mary, you're gonna have a baby. You're gonna have a baby, and you will call him Jesus. And then Mary was like, I'm not gonna have a baby yet. I'm only a teenager, I'm not married. Then the angel Gabriel told Joseph that Mary is not lying. You are having a new baby. And so they met up. They went to Bethlehem, which was Joseph's old town. They ride a donkey. I don't know. A camel. Oh, yeah, a camel. She said, this donkey's fast. They tried to go to a hotel, and they asked the keeper for a place to stay. The keeper said, we have no rooms. Literally, no rooms. So Mary and Joseph walked away sadly, but then he said, the only place here in Bethlehem that you can stay is a stable. And then he just pointed the way and they followed. When the shepherds were taking care of the sheep, then they saw angels. The angel said, a new baby is getting born, who is King of the Jews. The angels were singing. Glorious. And then the shepherd said, I think we should go there and meet him. The second, I think, said, yeah, I agree with you. And the other said, yeah, me too. They had to walk through a bunch of grass and bushes, maybe have to camp out a night. And then the wise men heard about it, and then a star appeared. We should probably follow that star. It's pointing down to the barn. So maybe we should follow it. Maybe. So the wise men went to Jesus. They gave them gifts. A stuffed animal, like a hippo one, that I have at home. Some diapers, and some wipes, and some milk, some shoes, some Jordans. Gold ring and Latimer. And I don't know how I would survive in that barn. Too stinky, too crowded, and ugh. I think he probably pooped because the room was very smelly. Thank you for coming. He's adorable. He's gonna be our best friend. I love you, and you're the best baby I ever seen. There, I said it. The new baby is gonna change the world.
Can't watch that and not laugh. Am I right? I watched that and I was cracking up laughing. And so I've seen it a few times, so my laughter wasn't as much, but it was so much fun to hear all of you laugh. And I was watching this thinking this is not only the most creative and adorable version of this Christmas story I've ever seen, but as funny as it is, it made me think of how we end up doing that a bit with our modern nativity scenes. We kind of superimpose our imaginations on what happened. Maybe we say there's Air Jordans, or they were wearing this, or it looked like this. The star was this way, and we can't help it. That's how we're hardwired for storytelling. And so we instantly kind of superimpose and say, this is what happened. This is what it must have looked like. And so the birth of Christ is something that millions of people all over the world come together to celebrate. And we're all so fascinated with this story. There's something magical about Christmas, isn't there? And if you like Christmas carols, there's something about that just feels so magical. And yet, what's so fascinating about this story is that we're so intrigued by it, and yet it's rarely mentioned in biblical text, which maybe gives it more mystery. Maybe if it was talked about all the time, we wouldn't be as intrigued. Gives it some mystery. There's so much mystery around this story. The nativity of Jesus is only found in 2 of the Gospels. In John and Mark, it's not mentioned at all. And in Matthew and Luke, it's mentioned. In Matthew, it's a short story, and Luke is quite a bit longer. The 2 birth stories, however, which is fascinating if you've ever studied it, they starkly differ from one another. And at some times offer conflicting perspectives, contradicting details. And so each one tells a story of a child that was born, yes, absolutely. But yet there's not much consistency in some of those details. And so to give you a real brief overview on this part before we move along, in Matthew, there's no story of a journey to Bethlehem, nor of angels or shepherds. Instead, this narrative focuses on Jesus' genealogy. So we hear a lot about the origin, this family line. We hear about Joseph. He becomes more of a central figure along with King Herod, whose plan, of course, we see is to kill the Christ child. It's in this story we also see the Magi. But it's surprising how little Matthew's account of Jesus' birth is actually about the birth. So that's fascinating. Then Luke's gospel, we find what we would see as sort of that typical manger scene. We see the manger and shepherds, angels singing in the night sky. But Luke takes a vastly different perspective, as Steve mentioned last week in reading of the Magnificat that Mary spoke. You see that he takes a different turn and he makes Mary the central figure of this story, as we hone in on her journey, their journey, and the birth of Christ. So throughout the ages, scholars have made a note that there probably weren't actually 3 wise men. We don't know the number. We've taken an educated guess. They probably didn't ride in on a donkey. It could have been a camel. We don't know. Animals in the stable, we also don't know. Snow on the ground, as we often see painted in pictures, we don't know. And yes, this is controversial, but even the definition of a virgin birth has been up for heated debate. And this goes round and round and round. And what I've noticed is that in Christianity, as fundamentalists, we've taken the story literally, word for word. As progressives, sometimes we've taken it so historically that we forget maybe its meaning. And there's this tension here between literal and historical, and yet sometimes we rarely look at it metaphorically speaking. And so many of us are still left with this question: did this really happen? What do these stories mean? What would giving birth to the Christ child have meant for people at that time? And I think another important question, probably the bigger question, is what does it mean for us today? Now, I say all that, you might say, Ange, well, where are you going? I say that because we're a church that states straight out the gate that questions and doubts are welcome. I imagine that if you're a person that has come here because you have questions and doubts, I imagine many of you have wondered at some point in your life, is this story true? I imagine at some point you said, is this true? But quite frankly, the stories of Christmas, they move beyond facts and reason. They move completely beyond facts and reason, and they start to use what Jesus uses often, parables and myth. And I want to pause for a moment and hang on that word myth, because I think when we often hear that word used, we hear it used to describe something as false. When we hear the word myth, we think, oh, that needs to be debunked. That's not true. I want to push in further. There's another definition of myth, and this is what I'm talking about. Now, when I'm using that word myth, I'm talking about a sacred narrative that's been handed down throughout the ages that explains a phenomenon of some kind and gives us meaning. It's often said that a myth is something so true it can only be told in metaphor, which is hard to wrap your mind around. We're talking about an ancient truth, something so true, like universal truth kind of true. It can only be told in metaphor. Stories and myths, they have this power, this way of captivating us, of telling life's deepest mysteries and meanings, and they paint a picture of just what it means to be human. And I think the interesting thing about a story like this is if it was just one simple way, we don't have to churn on it. We don't have to question it. We take it for face value and we walk away. When there's something that invites you in, you dig deeper and you say, what does this mean for me? What is this story saying? Author William Paul Young writes in his best-selling book, The Shack, while some things may not be scientifically provable, they can still be true nonetheless. Take, for instance, your feelings. You probably can't prove them scientifically. They're real, yes? Some truths are so big, maybe they can't be proven in that sense, but they can be told in a metaphor in a way that is a bigger truth. But in the same breath, a truth sometimes, not always, but sometimes can lose its meaning when it's presented as pure facts. When we read a story as only literal, we're only able to see it through that one lens. When we read a story that we pair with metaphor and pair with history, pair with well-read assumptions, we can sit here and open up ourselves to endless possibilities, a story that can grow within us and meanings. And as Rob Bell says, it's like turning the gem. He often uses this illustration of a gem. You turn the gem and you see it from one perspective, only to rotate it and see it from another one. It's all one thing, but you keep rotating it and it grows and expands and has new meaning. So now something to note. The birth stories were written 50 years after the life of Christ. During this 50-year period, and this is important to note because it really shapes these stories, during this 50-year period, the temple and the city of Jerusalem were brutally destroyed by the Romans. This was a time of deep pain, suffering, oppression, and darkness. So it's here, with that backstory, that we will read of the birth of Jesus together in Luke chapter 2. And to give it a little bit of a fresh feel, because I have a feeling from knowing many of you, you've been born and raised in church and probably heard this story a million times. I'm going to read this out of the Voice translation, just to give a little bit of a different perspective. Around the time of Elizabeth's amazing pregnancy and John's birth, which Steve talked about last week, the emperor in Rome, Caesar Augustus, required everyone in the Roman Empire to participate in a massive census. The first census since Quirinius had become governor of Syria. Each person had to go to his or her ancestral city to be counted. Now, I want to pause for 1 second. This we tend to skip over when we start to hear of names and places and things. I've noticed this. We tend to do this often. We tend to drone out. No, that's boring. We skip it along. This is crucial because this is a crucial part of the story because it gives us insights for people at this time, which would be Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. The purpose of this census that Luke is talking about is to ensure that everyone pays their taxes. But more than anything is so that everyone knows who's in charge. This sends a really, really strong, clear message that empire is power. These are people living under an oppressive boot of the empire. So as we read along, Mary's fiancé, Joseph, from Nazareth in Galilee, had to participate in the census in the same way everyone else did, because he was a descendant of King David. His ancestral city was Bethlehem, David's birthplace. Mary, who was now late in her pregnancy, that the messenger Gabriel had predicted accompanied Joseph. And while in Bethlehem, she went into labor and gave her birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped the baby in a blanket and laid him in a feeding trough because the inn had no room for them. Nearby, in the fields outside of Bethlehem, a group of shepherds were guarding their flocks from predators in the darkness of the night. And suddenly, a messenger of the Lord stood in front of them, and the darkness was replaced by a glorious light. The shining light of God's glory, and they were terrified. The messenger said, "Don't be afraid. Listen, I bring you good news. News of great joy. News that this will affect all people everywhere. Today in the city of David, a liberator has been born for you." There's so much going on here. And again, we tend to skip through the story and we hear it. There's so much going on here. This Christmas story is complex and it is mysterious. I want to show you an image. It's a painting by Kelly Lattimore titled Refugees, La Sagrada Familia, and it basically means the sacred family. Kelly Lattimore does modern sacred icons. She'll take old, ancient icons and turn them into a modern-day picture. So when we see of this sacred family in this story, it looks a lot like a refugee family fleeing to a foreign land out of persecution, doesn't it? It looks a lot like a teenage mother giving birth during an oppressive and violent time. It looks a lot like a God who became human to embody divine love and show you and I how to do the same. It looks a lot like a glimmer of hope and light born in the darkness. And this Christmas, I wrestled with what does Christmas mean this year? And every year, I think it takes on different shape and different meanings. And this Christmas, when I read this incarnation story, I couldn't help but think of the contrasting darkness and light. And I think it's no coincidence that Luke's text, it paints a setting at nighttime in the darkness. It mirrors what he's talking about, this tension of the time, the disadvantaged people waiting for the arrival of light. And I think we could say that Luke's gospel is about the radiance being born in the darkness. Now, speaking of darkness, yesterday, some of you might know this, was the darkest day of the year. In case you missed it, it was the winter solstice. It's the day that's marked as the shortest day, the shortest time of daylight, the longest night for the northern hemisphere. The word solstice itself means sun stands still. Now, for a moment, the sun, it seems to vanish, and then for 3 days, the sun neither grows nor diminishes to the human eye. And so you can't see it increasing or decreasing. It seems to remain in elevation about the same. And so our days aren't getting longer yet. It's just hovering here. And then after those 3 days, the light begins to grow again with the rebirth of the sun. Now, currently, Christmas and winter solstice, they're 3 days apart. You'll notice that. We just had solstice yesterday, and we will have Christmas in a few days. Yet, before the Julian calendar at that time was replaced with the current calendar, which we use today, the Gregorian calendar, they were both observed on the same day. Anyone have a guess what day that is? December 25th. So on one sacred day, we would have the birth of the sun, the S-U-N, and the birth of the sun, S-O-N. Radiance being born in the darkness. Now, many Christians aren't aware that our Christian traditions really are appropriated, if you will, from ancient solstice celebrations, our liturgical calendar, based on these things. In fact, most of our religious holidays are. And what most people can feel is this tension, like, oh, that's this, that is that, and we oppose them. And the two are often viewed as opposition to one another. this earth-based spirituality and this Christ-based spirituality, instead of looking at it as continual revelations of the divine. See, early Christians, Christian mystics, and Celtic traditions, they knew how to embrace both. They understood this. They knew that everything was echoing the divine. They saw it as this, the first incarnation, which is God revealed in the cosmos. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, when we read of Genesis 1? God revealed in the cosmos. Then the second incarnation, God revealed in humanity. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, when we read in John, the Word became flesh. And it's this echoing of this story that God is in all and through all. The darkness we read about in the book of Luke is full of sorrow, suffering, violence, oppression, and yet soon magnificent birth. The darkness we feel during a cold winter day is full of loneliness and pain, and yet soon magnificent birth. This ancient wisdom, if you're following along, you'll know is found in Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, right? We know this. Nature knows this. We know it in our bones and in our being, that everything has a season, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Author and spiritual director Alexander Shaya speaks of the following topic at great lengths. If you want to know more about him, look him up. He speaks about this topic extensively, and he says the following, which is beautiful. Christmas is a teaching for the most critical of all spiritual practices, to know that it's only by our courage and grace to go into the deepest darkness, which is where the fresh radiance is born. Let me say that again, because I think it's ancient wisdom. That it's when we go into the deepest dark, we face our deepest dark, that's where the fresh radiance is born. Author Shannon Casey also shares similar sentiments and writes these beautiful words. In the darkness of the womb, the future is waiting to be born. May we have ears to hear the midwife as she compassionately reminds us to breathe. Our lives begin in the darkness of the womb. And just like sweet Mary, what light awaits to be born within you? Now, if some of you are still scratching your head going, what does this even mean, Angie? One, I want to encourage you to ask those questions within yourself. What does this mean? But let me make it very practical on a ground level. Are you facing a difficult time this holiday season? Are you feeling tired? Are you feeling lonely? Are you heavy? Are you weary? Are you needing a fresh renewal? Is life stretching you? Are you feeling expansive, but maybe it's leaving you a bit restless? Something is growing in you. Know that the light is born in those times of darkness. Hold on, birth is coming. So is this Christmas story true? You ask. And I simply sit here and think, what could be more true than waiting and wonder and suffering and pain, darkness and light and birth and newness? There's nothing more true than that. So can we see that everything is telling the same magnificent cosmic story? That whether it's through nature or it's through humanity, whether it's through the Christ child, that God is within us. That the light is shining in the darkness, that the newness is waiting to be born. And I want to give some time to think about that and ponder, what does that mean for me at this time? You know, the holidays are a really busy season. It's quite the opposite of what nature does. See, nature does at this time, it rests. Winter, it rests. And the trees, which they seemingly look like they're dying, their roots grow deeper. They collect nourishment. They seek out water. They know this is a time for growth, but this is a time for rest. In our Western culture, we do the opposite. We go into shopping mode and purchasing and spending and hosting and planning and stress and chaos. We do the opposite of what the whole world around us is saying. It's saying, slow down, slow down. And so we find ourselves in a hurried moment, but sometimes we find ourselves in these moments of pain and darkness or change, and we don't give ourselves enough time to rest, to push into that and say, what is this teaching me? So at this time, I want to invite you to join in a candle lighting ceremony with us. And if you don't have a candle at this time, you can feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and signify one of our greeters. If for whatever reason you came in late and didn't get a candle, we'd like for you to participate. So if you want to go ahead and stand at this time and have your candles ready, those on the center aisles, you'll have your candle lit first. And then what I'd like you to do is once you have yours lit, go ahead and slowly light the person's candle next to you. And this also is one of those exercises that requires you to be a little bit closer, because you have to get close to the person next to you to light their candle. Feel free to huddle in close. And when the candles are lit one by one, I want you to reflect on this, that as you're lighting one another's candles, it's symbolic of our unity. It's symbolic of the shared light that we have together in the divine. It's symbolic of the shared light we have from one person to another. It's symbolic of your friend that may be feeling dark or weary or heavy, and you gave them some light. It's symbolic of you needing some light. You're the one feeling heavy and weary and tired. See, it's when we come together in our collected light, our collected Christness, that we have such power. It only takes one candle to illuminate a tiny space, but when we collect that, it's unstoppable. So as your candle is lit, take a moment to ponder, what does this season mean to you? Sometimes we don't even think about it. We just rush from one season to the next, which is the beauty of the liturgical calendar. In a way, it tells you to slow down and pay attention. Are you here? Are you present? So what does this season mean to you? Now, this one's a bit tough because it will require some soul searching. But in what parts of your life are you trying to push away the darkness as fast as you can instead of living with it as a teacher and transformer? Now, I know a lot of us have negative connotations with that word darkness. I'm talking about when you're in moments of struggle. That's what I'm talking about, leaning into that. Can you lean into that? What is this teaching you? Because growth comes in those moments. In what ways can you receive God's gift of light? And in what ways can you share that gift with others? We'll take a moment to rest in this, to just sit in this moment and reflect. And then we'll join together in song, in one voice, with our candles lit with one flame, knowing that we're all filled with light. this moment a moment of prayer. You can make this moment a moment of reflection, drawing an awareness to how you feel, drawing an awareness to maybe what you're hearing or sensing or feeling from the divine.